Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and welcome to this segment in our study on the book of Revelation. This is part 3 in our examination of the seven trumpets, and this is going to be a very packed segment, and I hope that if necessary you will listen to it 2 or 3 times to make sure that you've correctly heard everything that needed to be heard. You already know about corporate intercession. You know that God has 2 altars in heaven's true temple. One is the altar of incense, the golden altar. The other altar is the altar of burnt offering, and in fact that altar is described in the 5th seal, where the souls, are under the altar. In the Old Testament, the blood of the sacrifices was kept at the base of the altar of burnt offering. So we find both altars in heaven's true temple. That's my point there. Now, you know that corporate intercession is where God, Jesus, stepped in the way and has been corporately interceding on behalf of the whole world ever since the day Adam and Eve sinned. And you also know about the use of incense. So now the last thing you need to know about this service of where the censer is thrown down is what that means. Let's go back to the computer screen and let's take a look. In Bible times, censers were little metal buckets or skillets that were used for the purpose of carrying fire from one place to another. In those days, there were no matches or butane lighters. So it was a lot easier to carry fire around than to start a fire. Thus, censers, or skillets for the purpose of carrying fire, in ancient times were rather common household devices. Censers were also used at the temple for the purpose of carrying fire. The fire on the altar of incense never went out. Even when Israel carried the tabernacle from place to place, the fire from the altar was carried in a censer. It never went out. Notice how the censer was used on the Day of Atonement. In Leviticus 16:12, Moses writes, he, that is the high priest, he's now taking instruction. God is telling Moses what the high priest is to do. And God says, he, the high priest, is to take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord, that would be the altar of incense, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and take them behind the veil, or the curtain that separated the 2 rooms. He's going into the most holy place. And while he's in there, he is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the atonement cover above the testimony. In other words, the mercy seat, which is right above the Ark of the Covenant. It's on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, which is above the 10 Commandments. That is the testimony. The testimony is called the 10 Commandments. So the smoke from the incense will conceal the mercy seat above the 10 Commandments so that he will not die. In other words, where the Shekinah glory is resting, this smoke provides a hiding place for the high priest as he stands before God. The point here is that temple censers were used for the purpose of atonement. You may recall in Numbers 16, there's a very interesting story about the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. They concluded that Moses and Aaron had just appointed themselves to speak for God, and they were sick and tired of listening to Moses and Aaron. But God became very angry with the whole nation of Israel because they joined in with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And there's a big showdown. I don't have time to go through that, but I hope you'll read Numbers 16, all of it. Here's the critical point for our study today. And the Lord said to Moses, when this showdown had been finished and Korah, Dathan, and Abiram had been swallowed up by an earthquake, the Lord said to Moses, get away from this whole assembly so I can put an end to them at once. And the Bible says, and Moses and Aaron fell face down. They were scared to death. Numbers 16, verse 46, Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put incense in it, along with fire from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord. The plague has started." So I imagine Aaron's little short legs ran as fast as he could into the middle of the camp of Israel. That's where the temple was kept, in the middle of the assembly. And the plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered the incense and made atonement for them. Verse 48, one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible. Number 16:48, Aaron stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. What a beautiful, wonderful example of intercession. And that's what Jesus has been doing, is literally standing between the living, those who are alive in Christ and spiritually born again, and the dead who are swamped in their carnal nature. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. Verse 49, but 14,700 people died from the plague before Aaron could get there. That's how fast the wrath of God had broken out. That's not counting those who died because of Korah. He and his family were all swallowed up. Those three families were swallowed up in that earthquake. Now that you know what censers are, instruments of atonement, and how they were used, in atonement services, the big picture behind this simple event in Revelation 8 through 5 becomes possible to grasp. Number one, here it is. God's patience ran out in 1994 at the end of 70 Jubilee cycles. The seven angels were given the seven trumpets at that time. The seven trumpets represent seven punitive judgments that are coming upon the earth. Before the first four angels, though, can sound their trumpets, they are told to wait until the 144,000 are sealed. And they will be sealed when the perfect time arrives. Then, at this perfect time, an angel approaches the altar of incense, and he offers much incense on the altar, and the fragrance ascends before God, together with all the prayers of the saints who are living on earth. Now, we're talking about an event that is still future. I'll say more about that in a minute. Then, the angel fills his censer with fire, and he throws it down on the earth, and four physical signs follow. Putting the fire from the altar in the censer and throwing it down indicates the end of corporate intercession. There will be no more services at the altar of incense. It's over. It's finished. Corporate intercession is over. This explains why and how God's wrath breaks out. Jesus has been standing in the way, and God's wrath breaks out. The fourth seal is broken. Censers cast down, and it's marked by global earthquake number 1. I hope you understand how this all comes together so completely. Truth is proven by the harmony that comes from the sum of all of its parts. Daniel 12:11 says, from the time that the daily, it should be the word service there. There's no word there in reality. Translators have inserted the word sacrifice because they know that there were daily sacrifices in the temple. But this verse is talking about heaven, not the true tabernacle, not the one that was destroyed in AD 70. So from the time that the daily service in heaven's temple is abolished, and the abomination that causes desolation is set up on earth, there will be 1,290 days. The abomination that causes desolation, when we get to that, that's the universal death decree. So it's 1,290 days from the time the censer's cast down until the universal death decree on God's people is set up. So daily atonement will not be offered anymore on the altar of incense. Therefore, when the censer's cast down, God's corporate wrath breaks out upon earth's inhabitants. The fourth seal is broken. Rumblings, lightnings, thunders, and a global earthquake follow. The world is stopped in its tracks. The whole world will be put on notice with these four phenomena that God's anger with our corporate behavior, the majority of the people on this earth, will not be restrained or contained any longer. The appointed time, as it says in Daniel 8, 17 and 19, the appointed time for God's wrath has come, and shortly after these four manifestations, the first trumpet will sound in heaven, and fiery hail will fall from the sky and will burn up 1/3 of earth. The places that will be burned up will be those that are notoriously wicked places, like Los Angeles, like Las Vegas, like Houston. Places where their sin is rampant and violence is just out of control. Now, you might be wondering about the prayers of all the saints on earth. What in Revelation 8 is their petition? This is a very good question because the saints cannot know the timing of this service in heaven's temple, because this service occurs shortly before the censer is cast down and the global earthquake occurs. See if this explanation makes any sense to you. First, the Bible does not say what the saints are praying about. We know that saints are praying every day to God, but this service in heaven is not an everyday event, and neither are these prayers. However, there is one thing that all of God's saints would pray about at the same time under the right circumstances. Here it is. I believe that very soon a great war will erupt in the Middle East, and this war will escalate until there is a nuclear exchange. Tens of millions of people are going to die in this war, because this war will affect our global economy. The distribution of oil, food, clothing, building materials, and supplies of all kinds will stop. This war will be a fearful event, and the words of Iran's current president may be quite prophetic. It is his intention, he says, to wipe Jerusalem off of the map. If Israel was totally destroyed by nuclear bombs, what would this do to the theology of hundreds of millions of Christians who believe that the temple will be rebuilt? Because this war will be nuclear and the consequences so far-reaching, the whole world will come together crying out for peace and safety. Anxiety will be very great, and all of God's people will be praying for the same thing: the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Now let me make a point. A nuclear exchange doesn't mean Israel only. I'm talking about bombs going in lots of directions. I'm talking about destruction on a global scale. You know, you've got North Korea at the present time, and you've got Iran at the present time, and you've got Pakistan and India. 40 nations having nuclear energy, nuclear bombs, and Israel having nuclear bombs. I'm just saying, I think a great war is going to begin that will ultimately include nuclear exchange. And out of this horrific consequence, the cry for peace and safety will become utmost among the living. The Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, while people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly. This destruction is not man-made. This destruction is God-made because the censer's cast down. At a time when people are crying out for peace and safety, sudden destruction will come as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Meaning, but he's using the illustration here, you can tell by looking at a pregnant woman if she's large enough and late enough in her pregnancy that the pains are truly labor, you know what's going to happen. So it will be. But you, brothers, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief. We have the more sure word of prophecy. Within the context of cries for peace and safety, the sudden destruction that Paul speaks about comes from God. While world leaders are doing their best to achieve peace and safety to stop further nuclear madness, God steps in. So, all of the saints on earth will be earnestly praying for the Lord's intervention and return. An angel in heaven is called to the altar of incense. He is given much incense to offer, and after presenting the petitions of all the saints, the Lord gives the nod, and the angel throws down the censer. In other words, throwing down the censer is the answer to their prayers. Corporate intercession stops. God's wrath breaks out, and Jesus is on his way to rescue his children. As I said earlier, the second coming is a parade of events requiring 1,335 days. If you think this nuclear exchange scenario I have presented is horrible, you haven't seen anything yet. Sudden destruction from God will miniaturize the nuclear exchange that is coming. God steps into the affairs of mankind with something bigger and more deadly than nuclear bombs. I've made myself a little note here to tell you a story. One day I was walking along my driveway and I saw a big black carpenter ant that had been attacked by 3 little ants. And the fight was just, vicious. The big ant was trying to bite off the heads of the little ants, and the little ants were trying to bite off the legs of the big ant. And I watched for a little bit as this whole drama was so intense. It was a fight to the finish, and I finished it. I stepped on all 4 of them. You see, I came in with something bigger than a nuclear bomb. I finished the struggle for everybody. And that's what God is going to do when man gets so violent and this nuclear exchange is so extensive. God steps in with something bigger to deal with the inhabitants of the earth. In fact, the first trumpet will burn up 1/3 of the entire world. And you know, when people survey the damage and they happen to notice which places get burned up, they're going to quickly surmise a profound fact. God is angry at our evil and violent ways. God is unhappy with our degeneracy and decadence, because it's going to be the wicked places like Sodom and Gomorrah that he burns up in every nation. So think of it as 1/3 of every nation, its wicked places burned up. Suddenly, man's biggest problem isn't nation against nation. It is God versus mankind. You see, the first trumpet changes everything. So let's look at all these four trumpets and notice what the Bible says. The first angel sounded his trumpet in heaven's temple, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up. A third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The word for grass translated here is the same word for green crops. We're talking famine. We're talking people will think the gates of hell have opened up and God is going to burn us all up with hellfire. You can see how fearful people are going to be. And when you begin to understand that 25% of the world's population is going to perish in these judgments, whoa, this will get the attention of the survivors. Verse 8, the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain. Well, what else would you call a rock that's a couple of miles in diameter but a huge mountain? You go to Colorado and you look at a rock that's 5,000 feet high, you'd say they call that a mountain. You know, you put a rock like that in Florida, people are going to call that rock. Well, you wouldn't have to be that big. The second angel sounded his trumpet in heaven's temple, and there came something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, flying through the atmosphere. It was thrown into the ocean, and a third of the ocean, a third of the sea, turned into blood. When water has all the oxygen boiled out of it, it turns in red. It turns red because the algae that takes over is red, the color red. It's called red tide. But look, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships upon the sea were destroyed. You know, incidentally, look at this text. Jesus said in Luke 21:25, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. I want to tell you something. 33% of the world's population live within 60 miles of an ocean. A third of the world's population lives within 60 miles of an ocean. So when that asteroid, Great Mountain, impacts the sea, the tsunami that occurs, that as a consequence, will distress every ocean eventually, but more so than that, it's going to wash clean the particularly wicked places that build up around the coasts of nations. Let's go on with the third trumpet. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. Okay, this great asteroid impacts a continent. And by impacting the geologic strata of that continent, by changing it, a third of the rivers become contaminated, and so do the fountains, the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. Wormwood simply means poison. A third of the waters turned bitter or poisonous, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Well, a great asteroid impact can affect water that will come out several hundred miles distant from the impact zone. People think the water is okay when it's contaminated. They drink the water and die. Verse 12. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. Now you say, what is that all about? A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. I want you to notice, I'm holding here a globe. And as this globe rotates around, I want you to look at the middle third, from the Tropic of Cancer to the Tropic of Capricorn. These lines represent about a third of the Earth's volume, and it's interesting to notice that 2/3 of the world's population lives in the middle third of the earth. So this darkness, I believe, will be caused by God releasing the volcanoes. The ring of fire, I believe, will cut loose, and 1,000 volcanoes will spew their ejecta into the atmosphere, and they will burn up particularly wicked places as as the lava rolls down the mountain. And as this great calamitous event occurs, the middle third of the earth is covered in darkness because the jet stream has picked up all of the debris and ejecta and ash from the volcanoes, and the result is global famine. Global famine. Let's go back to the computer screen. John says, as I watched, I heard an eagle. Verse 13. This is the last verse in Revelation 8. As I watched, I heard an eagle. Now this eagle is the fourth living creature. This is the one that had the face of an eagle, and this is the one that oversees the execution of the fourth seal. That's interesting. So I heard the fourth living creature, the one with the face of an eagle, say, he called out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe," 3 times, saying, "Condemned, condemned, condemned are the inhabitants of earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other 3 angels." Well, the last 3 trumpets are called 7 woes or 7 curses because they fall on wicked people. The first 4 trumpets fall on wicked places. Well, we're out of time for today's study. As I said at the beginning of today's study, I hope you will share this information with your friends and your family members so that they can begin to understand that God's got a plan. And this plan involves a lot of upheaval. But through it all, God is going to reveal His goodness and His love and His mercy in the midst of His wrath. And in so doing, save the ultimate and maximum number of people. Well, that's all we have for today. We will see you in our next broadcast. May God bless you is my prayer.